She didn't think twice. That was the thing about Maya Osei. She never calculated kindness. She never weighed the inconvenience against the reward, never paused to consider whether the person in front of her deserved her time. When she saw the old man stumble at the edge of the pavement outside Paddington Station, her body moved before her brain could offer a single reason to stay still. The rain had been falling for 20 minutes, not the gentle London drizzle that locals tolerated with mild irritation, but a serious, heavy, soaking rain that turned the streets into mirrors and made every awning overflow. Commuters moved fast, heads down, umbrellas tilted like shields. Nobody was stopping for anything. Nobody was looking sideways. The entire city had agreed, wordlessly, to keep moving. Nobody except Maya. She was already running late. She had a meeting on the other side of the city, a tote bag on one shoulder and a coffee cup in her hand, and exactly 40 minutes to get somewhere that required 45. She had every reason in the world to put her head down and join the moving crowd. Instead, she grabbed the old man's elbow before he could step off the curb and directly into the path of a black cab that was absolutely not slowing down. The cab horn blared. The man stumbled backward. Maya steadied him with both hands, her coffee tilting dangerously, her bag swinging off her shoulder. "Careful," she said. Just that word. Calm, steady, like she hadn't just yanked a stranger from the edge of something serious. The man blinked at her. He was older than she'd first registered, mid-70s, maybe more. His face was deeply lined but structured, the kind of face that had once been very handsome and still carried the architecture of it. His silver hair was plastered flat by the rain. His eyes were pale grey, sharp despite his obvious disorientation, and they fixed on Maya with an intensity that lasted just a half-second too long, the look of someone who wasn't used to being helped and didn't quite know what to do with it. He smelled like cedar and motor oil. She noticed that immediately, because it was such an unusual combination. Not unpleasant. Just specific, like a workshop hidden inside a very expensive wardrobe. His coat, she clocked in the same breath, was extraordinary, long, charcoal cashmere, the kind of garment that costs more than most people's monthly rent. But it was filthy. Not worn in. Not shabby chic. Filthy in the specific way of someone who had been wearing the same thing for days and sleeping somewhere they shouldn't have been sleeping. He was clutching a paper map. A folded, soggy, thoroughly useless paper map of central London that had been rained on so thoroughly it was barely holding its shape. Maya looked at the map. She looked at him. She looked at the signs above them, signs he had clearly been squinting at without success. "Where are you trying to go?" she asked. He hesitated. Something moved behind those grey eyes, a quick, private calculation. Then he said a name. A hotel name she didn't recognize, which was strange because Maya had lived in London for 11 years and knew the city the way a musician knows a well-played instrument, by feel, by instinct, by 10,000 repeated roots. "Say it again," she said. He did. She still didn't recognize it. But she typed it into her phone, and the address came up immediately, just 6 blocks away, those 6 complicated blocks through a part of the neighborhood that turned and doubled back on itself in ways that would absolutely defeat a man with a paper map in heavy rain. "Come on," she said. "I'll walk you." He looked at her the way people look when they're about to decline and then find themselves accepting instead, caught off guard by their own gratitude. He fell into step beside her without another word. They walked in silence mostly. The rain didn't ease. Maya matched his pace, slower than hers, more careful, a man who was watching the ground with the particular attention of someone whose body had recently reminded him it had limits. She held her umbrella tilted toward him without making a performance of it. He noticed. She could tell he noticed. But he didn't comment. Once, on the corner of a narrow side street, she thought she saw him sway very slightly, a tiny, almost imperceptible loss of balance, the kind that happened when exhaustion had gone deep into the bones. She moved half a step closer without looking at him. He steadied. They didn't talk about where he'd come from. They didn't talk about the map, or the rain, or the cab that had nearly changed everything. Once he asked her name. She told him. He didn't offer his in return, and she didn't ask. That felt right, somehow. Some encounters existed outside the usual rules of exchange. The building, when they reached it, looked nothing like a hotel. There was no signage she could see, no revolving door with a uniformed doorman, no obvious reception visible through the glass. Just a wide, dark, beautiful facade. Old stone, tall windows, a brass panel beside a single door that might have been a buzzer panel or might have been decorative. She had walked past this block before and never really looked at it. He stopped outside and turned to face her. Something in his expression had shifted. The disorientation was still there, buried underneath, but the surface had changed. He looked at her with a steadiness that felt earned, a man recollecting himself, pulling something back into place from wherever it had slipped to. He didn't smile. He just nodded. It was the kind of nod that carried weight. Not a polite nod, not a social nod, but the nod of someone making a private note of something important. She had seen that expression once before, on a surgeon who had watched her do something in a crisis and marked it somewhere in his mind. She had never forgotten it. She nodded back. He turned. The door opened before he touched it, from the inside, and he passed through without looking back. Maya stood on the pavement in the rain for about 3 more seconds. Then she hoisted her bag back up her shoulder, shook the water off her umbrella, and started walking toward the tube. She was now definitely going to be late. She found, surprisingly, that she didn't mind. She thought about him briefly on the train. The coat, the map, the cedar and motor oil smell, the way he'd looked at her on that curb, the first kind face he'd seen in days. She had felt that without being told. She had felt the specific texture of his relief, which was different from ordinary gratitude. Ordinary gratitude was warm. This had been something quieter, something more like recognition. But London was full of complicated people with private stories, and Maya had a meeting to get to, and by the time she surfaced at a stop, the old man in the cashmere coat had drifted to the comfortable edges of her attention. She forgot about him by morning. She did not think about him when she made coffee, or when she answered emails, or when she pulled on her jacket and headed back out into a city that had decided, overnight, to be beautiful, cold and bright and sharp-edged, the kind of London morning that made you feel like the whole place had been freshly printed. She thought about nothing unusual at all, until she stepped onto the tube platform and stopped so suddenly that the man behind her almost walked into her back. His face was everywhere. Every digital advertising board running the length of the platform. Every screen above every exit sign. Cycling in a slow, unavoidable rotation between the news ticker and the weather forecast and whatever else the city needed to say that morning. His face. That same face. Those pale grey eyes, caught in what looked like an official photograph, formal, precise, a man in a dark suit instead of a filthy cashmere coat, but the same bone structure, the same intensity, the same quality of someone who was used to being the most important person in any given room. And beneath it, in the bold, clean font of breaking news, words that rearranged everything she thought she knew about the previous evening. She stood completely still while the platform crowd poured around her like water around a stone. Commuters with headphones, tourists with cases, the whole ordinary rushing machinery of the city in motion. None of them stopping. All of them moving. Nobody except Maya. She read the headline. Then she read it again. Then she looked up at his face, that nod, that steady, weighted, private nod, and felt something she could not yet name begin to move slowly through her chest. Her phone was already in her hand. It buzzed before she could decide what to do with it. Maya read it once. Then she read it again, slowly, the way you reread something when your brain refuses to process it on the first pass because the information is simply too large to fit through the ordinary door of comprehension. 72 hours. She did the arithmetic without meaning to. Standing there on the platform with the crowd streaming around her and the screens cycling their slow, relentless rotation, she counted backward through the hours the way you count backward through a dream to find where it started. 72 hours ago she had been at her desk. 48 hours ago she had been in this same tube station. 24 hours ago, yesterday evening, just before 6 o'clock, with the rain coming down hard and the city putting its head down, she had been outside Paddington Station, running late, coffee in hand. The timeline matched. Perfectly, cleanly, without a single gap. The coat. She kept coming back to the coat. Cashmere, charcoal, expensive beyond any ordinary measure, but filthy in that specific, days-deep way that now meant something entirely different than it had meant yesterday. Not a man who had fallen on hard times. A man who had deliberately stepped outside his own life and stayed outside it long enough for the world to notice he was gone. She looked at the photograph again. Richard Cole. The name meant something. She could feel it pulling at the edges of her memory, snagged on something she had read or heard or half-absorbed from a headline she hadn't stopped for. Finance. Property. Infrastructure. The kind of name that appeared in articles she scrolled past because the world those articles described felt entirely removed from her own. The kind of man who owned buildings that other people worked inside without ever knowing his name. The kind of man who apparently, 3 days ago, had walked out of that world entirely. With a paper map. Her phone buzzed in her hand. She looked down. Unknown number. London area code, but nothing her phone recognized, nothing her contacts could match. She stared at it for 2 full rings, long enough for the woman beside her to glance over with mild curiosity, and then she answered. Miss Meyer O'Say. Not a question. A statement. Delivered in a male voice that was calm in the specific way of professionals who are paid to remain calm regardless of circumstances. Assistants, lawyers, the kind of people who existed in the orbit of very powerful men and absorbed some quality of that power themselves. Her stomach dropped 2 inches. Yes, she said. That's me. My name is Daniel Forsyth. I'm calling on behalf of Mr. Richard Cole. A pause, brief, measured, not uncomfortable. Mr. Cole asked us to contact you, Miss O'Say. He'd like to meet, if you're willing. Properly this time, as he put it. Another pause. There's something he'd like to give you. Maya opened her mouth, closed it. The train she needed was pulling into the platform. She watched it arrive, watched the doors open, watched the ordinary morning crowd compress and flow and disappear inside. She didn't move toward it. How do you have my number? She asked. Mr. Cole has considerable resources, Daniel Forsyth said. It wasn't evasion. It was simply the most accurate answer available. He was specific that we should tell you, this is entirely your choice. No obligation. No pressure. He wanted me to say those words to you directly. She almost laughed. She almost hung up. The part of her brain that had been raised on reasonable caution and sensible decisions was composing a very articulate response about privacy and boundaries and the correct way for billionaires to make contact with strangers they met in the rain. But another part of her was still standing on that pavement in the rain, watching him nod. That nod. She kept returning to it. She had processed it yesterday as simple gratitude, the compact, wordless thank you of a private man who didn't have the energy for more. But standing here now, with his face on every screen above her and a lawyer on the phone, she understood it differently. It had not been a thank you. It had been a recognition. The nod of someone who had just found exactly what he was looking for, even if she had not yet understood that she was it. When? She said. The meeting was set for 11 o'clock. The address Daniel gave her was in Mayfair, a street she knew by name but had never had reason to walk down, the kind of street that existed in the same city as her own but operated at a completely different altitude. She arrived 7 minutes early, which was simply who she was, and stood on the pavement outside a white stucco building that announced nothing about itself except absolute confidence. A man in a dark suit was already opening the door before she reached the top step. She was taken through a hallway that smelled like beeswax and old paper, up a single flight of stairs, into a room that was large and quiet and full of morning light. Books on 3 walls. A fireplace with something burning low in it despite the brightness of the day outside. 2 chairs arranged near the window, and between them a small table with tea already poured. Richard Cole was standing when she entered. Not in the filthy cashmere coat. He was wearing a dark navy suit, no tie, collar open, the suit of a man who had been dressed by someone else's insistence and had conceded to the jacket and trousers while quietly refusing the rest. His silver hair was clean and combed. He looked like the photograph on the screens, and he looked nothing like it, because the photograph had captured his status and the room contained his person. He looked, above everything else, rested, like a man who had slept for the first time in a week. He extended his hand when she crossed the room and shook hers with the firm, brief grip of someone who had shaken 10,000 hands and meant this one differently. Miss O'Say, he said. Please. Sit. They Saturday. She took the tea because her hands wanted something to hold. He watched her the way he'd watched her on the pavement, that same quality of attention, focused and unhurried and entirely without the performance of charm that she had expected and been prepared to deflect. He didn't waste time. I was gone for 4 days, he said. Not missing. Gone. There's a difference, though I understand the world doesn't make it easily. He looked at the fire for a moment, then back at her. I do this sometimes. Disappear from my own life for a few days to remember what it feels like to move through the world as an ordinary person. Without the name. Without the machinery. A brief pause. It usually goes smoothly. This time it went less smoothly. The rain, she said. Something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the structural possibility of one. The rain, he agreed. And perhaps 4 days was ambitious. My body disagreed with me more firmly than usual. She understood then what she had felt on that corner when he swayed. Not just exhaustion. Something more than that she hadn't had the information to name at the time. "I'm glad you were there," he said. It was simple. Direct. The words of a man who had edited out every unnecessary syllable. "I've had assistance from many people over many years. Security, staff, advisors. People paid to anticipate every difficulty before I encounter it. What you did was different." He looked at her steadily. "You didn't know who I was. You helped me anyway. That is rarer than it sounds." Maya wrapped both hands around her tea. "It wasn't remarkable," she said. "You needed help. It was raining." "Yes," he said. "Exactly." The word landed with a weight she hadn't expected. Like she had just confirmed something he'd already believed, something he had been carrying as a quiet thesis about the world and had now found evidence for. Daniel Forsyth appeared in the doorway then, the same calm voice, now attached to a tall man in his 40s with a leather folder under his arm. He placed the folder on the small table between them. Richard Cole didn't open it. He just rested one hand on it and looked at her. "I'd like to offer you something," he said. "Not as payment. I want to be clear about that. Payment is transactional and what you gave me wasn't a transaction." He paused. "I've spent 40 years building things, buildings, systems, foundations. I know how to identify something worth investing in. I'd like to invest in whatever it is you're building." Maya looked at the folder. She looked at the man who had nodded at her in the rain like she was the only real thing left in his world. She looked at the pale grey eyes that were watching her now with the same steadiness they'd had on the pavement. No performance, no pressure, just a man waiting to see what she would do next with the same patient. Genuine curiosity he'd apparently been applying to the world for 70-something years. Outside the window, the city moved in its ordinary, relentless way. Somewhere across London, the screens were still cycling. Somewhere, the headline was still running. But in this quiet room with its firelight and its morning tea and its 2 chairs arranged like the beginning of something neither of them had planned, Maya felt the distinct, unmistakable sensation of a door opening. She set down her cup. She reached for the folder.